Okay, how's it going, everybody? So we're going to read section 5 of V.I. Lenin, V.I. Lenin's book, Left-Wing Childishness. And not his book, his pamphlet written in 1918, Left-Wing Childishness. Let's go ahead and get into this. This is section 5. The following is also extremely instructive. When we argued with Comrade Bukharin in the Central Executive Committee, see President Edition, Volume 25, pages 358, 359 ED, he declared, among other things, that on the question of high salaries for specialists, we, evidently meaning the left communists, were, quote, more to the right than Lenin, end quote. For in this case, quote, we saw no deviation from principle. Bearing in mind Marx's words, that under certain conditions it is more expedient for the working class to, quote, buy out the whole lot of them, end quote. Namely, the whole capitalists, i.e. to buy from the bourgeoisie the land, factories, works, and other means of production. This extremely interesting statement shows in the first place that Bukharin is head and shoulders above the left socialist revolutionaries and anarchists, that he is by no means hopelessly stuck in the mud of phrase-making, but on the contrary is making efforts to think out the concrete difficulties of the transition, the painful and difficult transition from capitalism to socialism. In the second place, the statement makes Bukharin's mistake still more glaring. Let us consider Marx's idea carefully. Marx was talking about the Britain of the 70s, of the last century, about the culminating point in the development of pre-monopoly capitalism. At that time, Britain was a country in which militarism and bureaucracy were less pronounced than in any other. A country in which there was the greatest possibility of a, quote, peaceful victory for socialism, in the sense of the workers buying out the bourgeoisie. And Marx said that under certain conditions, the workers would certainly not refuse to buy out the bourgeoisie. Marx did not commit himself, or the future leaders of the socialist revolution, to matters of form, to ways and means of bringing about the revolution. He understood perfectly well that a vast number of new problems would arise, that the whole situation would change in the course of the revolution, and that the situation would change radically, and often is the course of revolution. Well, and what about Soviet Russia? Is it not clear that after the seizure of power by the proletariat, and after the crushing of the exploiters' armed resistance and sabotage, certain conditions prevail which correspond to those which might have existed in Britain half a century ago, and a peaceful transition to socialism begun there. The subordination of the capitalists to the workers in Britain would have been assured at the time owing to the following circumstance. 1. The absolute preponderance of workers, or proletarians, in the population, owing to the absence of peasantry in Britain. In the 70s, there was a hope of an extremely rapid spread of socialism among agricultural laborers. Number 2, the excellent organization of the proletariat and trade unions. Britain was at the time the leading country in the world in this respect. 3, the comparatively high level of culture of the proletariat, which had been trained by centuries of development of political liberty. 4, the old habit of the well-organized British capitalists of settling political and economic questions by compromise. At that time, the British capitalists were better organized than the capitalists of any country in the world. This superiority has now passed to Germany. These were the circumstances which at that time gave rise to the idea that the peaceful subjugation of the British capitalists by the workers was possible. In our country at the present time, the subjugation is assured by certain premises of fundamental significance: the victory in October and the suppression from October to February of the capitalist armed resistance and sabotage. But instead of the absolute preponderance of workers, of proletarians in the population, and instead of a high degree of organization among them, the important factor of victory in Russia was that the support of the proletarians received from the poor peasants and those who had experienced sudden ruin. Finally, we have neither a high degree of culture nor the habit of compromise. If these concrete conditions are carefully considered, it will become clear that we can and ought to employ two methods simultaneously. On the one hand, we must ruthlessly suppress the uncultured capitalists who refuse to have anything to do with, quote, state capitalism, end quote, or to consider any form of compromise, and who continue by means of profiteering, by bribing the poor peasants, etc. to hinder the realization of the measures taken by the Soviets. On the other hand, we must use the method of compromise or of buying off the culture capitalists who agree to, quote, state capitalism, end quote, who are capable of putting it into practice and who are useful to the proletariat as intelligent and experienced organizers of the largest type of enterprises, which actually supply products to tens of millions of people. Bukharin is an extremely well-read Marxist economist. He therefore remembered that Marx was profoundly right when he taught the workers the importance of preserving the organization of large-scale production, precisely for the purpose of facilitating the transition to socialism. Marx taught that, as an exception, and Britain was then an exception, the idea was conceivable of paying the capitalists well, of buying them off, if the circumstances were such as to compel the capitalists to submit peacefully and to come over to socialism in a cultured and organized fashion, provided they were paid. But Bukharin went astray because he did not go deep enough into the specific features of the situation in Russia at the present time, an exceptional situation when we, the Russian proletariat, are in advance of any Britain or any Germany as regards our political order, as regards the strength of the workers' political power, but are behind the most backward West European country as regards to organizing a good state capitalism, as regards our level of culture and the degree of material and productive preparedness for the introduction of socialism. Is it not clear that the specific nature of the present situation creates the need for a specific type of, quote, buying out, end quote, which the workers must offer to the most cultured, most skilled, most capable organizers among the capitalists who are ready to enter the service of the Soviet power and to help honestly in organizing, quote, state production on the largest possible scale? Is it not clear that in this specific situation we must make every effort to avoid two mistakes, both of which are of a petty bourgeois nature? On the one hand, it would be a fatal mistake to declare that since there is a discrepancy between our economic forces and our political strength, it, quote, follows that we should not have seized power. Such an argument can be advanced only by a man in a muffler, who forgets that there will always be such a discrepancy, that it always exists in the development of nature as well as in the development of society, that only by a series of attempts, each of which taken by itself will be one-sided and will suffer for certain inconsistencies, will complete socialism be created by the revolutionary cooperation of the proletarians of all countries. On the other hand, it would be an obvious mistake to give free rein to ranters and phrasemongers who allow themselves to be carried away by the dazzling revolutionary spirit, but who are incapable of sustained, thoughtful, and deliberate revolutionary work which takes into account the most difficult stages of transition. Fortunately, the history of the development of the revolutionary parties and the struggle that Bolshevism waged against them has left us a heritage of sharply defined types, of which the left socialist revolutionaries and anarchists are striking examples of bad revolutionaries. They are now shouting hysterically, choking, and shouting themselves hoarse against the, quote, compromise, end quote, of the, quote, right Bolsheviks, end quote. But they are incapable of thinking what is bad in compromise and why compromise has been justly condemned by history in the course of the revolution. Compromise in Kerensky's time meant the surrender of power to the imperialist bourgeoisie, and the question of power is the fundamental question of every revolution. Compromise by a section of the Bolsheviks in November 1917 either meant that they feared the proletariat seizing power or wished to share power equally, not only with, quote, unreliable fellow travelers, end quote, like the left socialist revolutionaries, but also with the enemies, with the Chernovists and the Mensheviks. The latter would inevitably have hindered us in fundamental matters, such as the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, the ruthless suppression of the Bogaevskis, the universal setting up of the Soviet institutions, and in every act of confiscation. Now power has been seized, retained, and consolidated in the hands of a single party, the party of the proletariat. Even without the unreliable fellow travelers, to speak of compromise at the present time when there is no question, and can be done, of sharing power, of renouncing the dictatorship of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie, is merely to repeat parrot fashion, words which have been learned by heart but not understood, to describe as, quote, compromise, end quote. The fact that, having arrived at a situation when we can and must rule the country, we try to win over to our side, not grudging the cost. The most skilled people capitalism has trained, and to take them into our service against small proprietary disintegration reveals a total incapacity to think out the economic task of socialist construction. Therefore, while it is to Comrade Bukharin's credit that on the Central Executive Committee he, quote, felt ashamed of the quote, service he had been rendered by Karelin and Gay. Nevertheless, as far as the, quote, left communist trend is concerned, the reference to their political comrades in arms still remains a serious warning. Take, for example, Znamya Truda, the organ of the left socialist revolutionaries of April 25, 1918, which proudly declares, quote, the present position of our party coincides with that of another trend in Bolshevism, Bukharin, Pokrovsky, and others, end quote. Or take the Menshevik Feryat of the same date, which contains, among other articles, the following thesis by the notorious Menshevik Isuf. Quote, the policy of Soviet power from the very outset of devoid of a genuinely proletarian character has lately pursued more and more openly a course of compromise with the bourgeoisie and has assumed an obviously anti-working class character. On the pretext of nationalizing industry, they are pursuing a policy of establishing industrial trusts, and on the pretext of restoring the productive forces of the country, they are attempting to abolish the 8-hour day. They introduce piecework and the tailor system, blacklists, and victimization. This policy threatens to deprive the proletariat of its most important economic gains and to make it a victim of unrestricted exploitation by the bourgeoisie, end quote. Back to Lenin. Isn't it marvelous? Kerensky's friends, who, together with them, conducted an imperialist war for the sake of the secret treaties, which promised annexations to the Russian capitalists, the colleagues of Tsereteli, who, on June 11, threatened to disarm the workers, the Liberduns, who screamed the rule of the bourgeoisie with high-sounding phrases. These are the very people who accuse Soviet power of, quote, compromising with the bourgeoisie, end quote, of, quote, establishing trust, end quote, that is, establishing state capitalism, of introducing the tailor system. Indeed, the Bolsheviks ought to present Isov with a medal, and his thesis ought to be exhibited in every workers' club and union as an example of the productive speeches of the bourgeoisie. The workers know these Liberduns, and Tseretelis, and Isovs very well now. They know them from experience, and it would be extremely useful indeed for the workers to think over the reason why such lackeys of the bourgeoisie should incite the workers to resist the tailor system and the, quote, establishment of trust, end quote. Class-conscious workers will carefully compare thesis of Isov and a friend of the Liberduns and Tseretelis with the following thesis of the left communists. Quote, the introduction of the labor discipline in connection with the restoration of capitalist management of industry cannot considerably increase the productivity of labor, but it will diminish the class initiative, activity, and organization of the proletariat. It threatens to enslave the working class. It will arouse discontent from the backward elements as well as among the vanguard of the proletariat. In order to implement the system in the face of the hatred prevailing among the proletariat against the, quote, capitalist saboteurs, end quote, the Communist Party would have to rely on the petty bourgeoisie as against the workers, and in this way would ruin itself as the party of the proletariat, end quote. Communist number 1, page 8, CL2, end quote. This is the most striking proof that the lefts have fallen into the trap, have allowed themselves to be provoked by the ISIS and the other Judases of capitalism. It serves as a good lesson for the workers, who know that it is precisely the vanguard of the proletariat which stands for the introduction of labor discipline, and that is precisely the petty bourgeoisie which is doing its utmost to disrupt this discipline. Speeches such as the thesis of the, quote, lefts, quoted above, are a terrible disgrace, and imply the complete renunciation of communism in practice, and complete desertion to the camp of the petty bourgeoisie. Quote, in connection with the restoration of the capitalist management, end quote, these are the words with which the left communists hope to, quote, defend themselves, end quote. A perfectly useless defense, because in the first place, when putting management in the hands of capitalists, Soviet power appoints workers, commissars, and workers' committees who watch the managers every step, who learn from his management experience, who not only have the right to appeal against his orders, but can secure his removal through the organs of Soviet power. In the second place, management is entrusted to capitalists only for executive functions while at work, the conditions of which are determined by the Soviet power by which they may be abolished or revised. In the third place, management is entrusted by the Soviet power to capitalists, not as capitalists, but as technicians or organizers for higher salaries. And the workers know how well that 99% of the organizers and first-class technicians of really large-scale and giant enterprises, trusts, or other establishments belong to the capitalist class. But it's precisely these people whom we, the proletarian party, must appoint to manage the labor process and the organization of production, for there are no other people who have practical experience in this matter. The workers, having grown out of the infancy when they could have been misled by left phrases or petty bourgeois loose thinking, are advancing towards socialism precisely through the capitalist management of trusts, through gigantic machine industry, through enterprises which have turnover of several millions per year. Only through such a system of production and such enterprises, only through such a system of production and such enterprises. The workers are not petty bourgeois. They are not afraid of large-scale state capitalism. They prize it as their proletarian weapon, with which their Soviet power will use against small proprietary disintegration and disorganization. This is incomprehensible only to the D-class and consequently thoroughly petty bourgeois intelligentsia, typified among the left communists by Osinski when he writes in their journal, quote, "To the whole initiative in the organization and management of any enterprise will belong to the, quote, organizers of the trust," end quote. "We are not going to teach them or make rank and file workers out of them. We are going to learn from them," end quote. Communist number 1, page 14, CL2. The attempted irony in this passage is aimed at my words, quote, "learn socialism from the organizers of the trust," end quote. Orensky thinks this is funny. He wants to make rank and file workers out of the organizers of the trust. If this had been written by a man of the age of which the poet wrote, quote, "but 15 years, not more," end quote, there would have been nothing surprising about it. But it is somewhat strange to hear such things from a Marxist who has learned that socialism is impossible unless it makes use of the achievements of the engineering and culture created by large-scale capitalism. There is no trace of Marxism in this. No, only those are worthy of the name of communists who understand that it is impossible to create or introduce socialism without learning from the organizers of the trust. For socialism is not a figment of the imagination, but the assimilation and application by the proletarian vanguard, which has seized power, of what has been created by the trust. We, the party of the proletariat, have no other way of acquiring the ability to organize large-scale production on trust lines, as trusts are organized, except by acquiring it from first-class capitalist experts. We have nothing to teach them unless we undertake the childish task of, quote, teaching the bourgeois intelligentsia socialism. We must not teach them, but expropriate them. As is being done in Russia, determinedly enough. Put a stop to their sabotage. Subordinate them as a section or group to Soviet power. We, on the other hand, if we are not communists or of infantile age and infantile understanding, must learn from them. And there is something to learn, for the party of the proletariat and its vanguard have no experience of independent work in organizing giant enterprises which serve the needs of scores of millions of people. The best workers in Russia have realized this. They have begun to learn from the capitalist organizers, the managing engineers and the technicians. They have begun to learn steadily, cautiously, with easy things, gradually passing on to the more difficult things. If things are going more slowly in the iron and steel of engineering industries, it is because they present greater difficulties. But the textile and tobacco workers and tanners are not afraid of, quote, state capitalism, end quote, or of, quote, learning from the organizers of the trust, end quote, as the declassed petty bourgeois intelligentsia are. These workers are the central leading institutions, like Chief Leather Committee and Central Textile Committee, take their place by the side of the capitalists. Learn from them, establish trust, establish, quote, state capitalism, end quote, which under Soviet power represents the threshold of socialism, the condition of its firm victory. This work of the advanced workers of Russia, together with their work of introducing labor discipline, has begun and is proceeding quietly, unobtrusively, without the noise and fuss so necessary to some, quote, lefts. It is proceeding very cautiously and gradually, taking into account the lessons of practical experience. This hard work, the work of learning practically, is how to build up large-scale production, is the guarantee that we are on the right road, the guarantee that the class-conscious workers in Russia are carrying out the struggle against small proprietary disintegration and disorganization, against petty bourgeois indiscipline, the guarantee of the victory of communism. Two remarks in conclusion. In arguing with the left communists on April 4th, 1918, see Communist number 1, page 4, footnote, I put it to them bluntly, quote, explain what you are dissatisfied with in the railway decree. Submit your amendments to it. It is your duty as Soviet leaders of the proletariat to do so, otherwise what you say is nothing but empty phrases, end quote. In the first issue of Communists appeared on April 20 of 1918, but did not contain a single word about how, according to the left communists, the railway decree should be altered or amended. The left communists stand condemned by their own silence. They did nothing but attack the railway decree with all sorts of insinuations, pages 8 and 16 of number 1. They gave no articulate answer to the question, quote, how should the decree be amended if it is wrong, end quote. No comment is needed. The class-conscious workers will call such, quote, criticism, end quote, of the railway decree, which is a typical example of our line of action, the line of firmness, the line of dictatorship, the line of proletarian discipline, either Isuvian criticism or empty phrase-making. Second remark, the first issue of Communist contained a very flattering review by Comrade Bukharin of my pamphlet, The State and Revolution. But however much I value the opinion of people like Bukharin, my conscience compels me to say that the character of the review reveals a sad and significant fact. Bukharin regards the task of the proletarian dictatorship from the point of view of the past and not of the future. Bukharin noted and emphasized what the proletarian revolution and the petty bourgeois revolutionary may have in common on the question of the state. But Bukharin, quote, overlooked the very thing that distinguishes the one from the other. Bukharin noted and emphasized that the old state machinery must be, quote, smashed and blown up, end quote. That the bourgeoisie must be, quote, finally and completely strangled, end quote, and so on. The frenzied petty bourgeoisie may also want this. And this, in the main, is what our revolution has already done between October 1917 and February 1918. In my pamphlet, I also mention what even the most revolutionary petty bourgeois cannot want, what the class-conscious proletarian does want, what our revolution has not yet accomplished. On this task, the task of tomorrow, Bukharin said nothing. And I have all the more reason not to be silent on this point because, in the first place, a communist is expected to devote greater attention to the task of tomorrow and not of yesterday. And in the second place, my pamphlet was written before the Bolsheviks seized power, when it was impossible to treat the Bolsheviks to vulgar petty bourgeois arguments such as, quote, yes, of course, after seizing power, you begin to talk about discipline, end quote. Quote, socialism will develop into communism, since people will become accustomed to observing the elementary conditions of social life without violence and without subordination, end quote. The State and Revolution, pages 7 through 78. Thus, quote, elementary conditions were discussed before the seizure of power. Quote, only then will democracy begin to wither away, end quote. When, quote, people gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copied book maxims. They will become accustomed to observing them without force, without coercion, without the special apparatus for coercion called the state, end quote. The State and Revolution, page 462. Thus mention was made of quote, copy book maximus, end quote, before the seizure of power. Quote, the higher phase of the development communism, end quote, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Quote, presupposes not the present productivity of labor, and not the present ordinary run of people, who like the seminary students in Pomyalovsky's story, are capable of damaging the stocks of public wealth just for fun, and of demanding the impossible, end quote. State and Revolution, pages 469, 470. Until the higher phase of communism arrives, quote, until the higher phase of communism arrives, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the measure of labor and the measure of consumption, end quote. Quote, accounting and control, that is mainly what is needed for the smooth working, for the proper functioning of the first phase of communist society, end quote. The State and Revolution, page 473. And this control must be established not only over, quote, the insignificant capitalist minority, over the gentry who wish to preserve their capitalist habits, end quote, but also over the workers who, quote, have been thoroughly corrupted by capitalism, end quote. The State and Revolution, page 474, and over the parasites, the sons of the wealthy, the swindlers, and other guardians of capitalist traditions, end quote. It is significant that Bukharin did not emphasize this. All right, then he signs it, Lenin, May 5th, 1918. Okay, yeah, so that's the fifth part of Left-Wing Childishness by V.I. Lenin. Well, thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium, all of those are Marxist. Y'all can hit me up there. Y'all have a great day, and the Dada